All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us here tonight. It says so much to me how much you care about our urban forests, that you want to take the best care of it you can, and I appreciate that and I'm encouraged by it. Tonight, we're going to talk about caring for your trees and about conserving water, which are two goals that can easily go hand in hand. My name is Pam Sanchez, and I'm a certified arborist at the Sacramento Tree Foundation. I've had the pleasure of getting paid to talk to people about trees for a long time, and it's my pleasure to be with you here this evening. I would also like to introduce my colleague, Marisol. She will be answering all the questions in the Q&A tonight. She is also a tree expert. This evening, for any questions that you have during the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A. We will not be using the chat feature. It's much easier to track in the Q&A, so that's where all your questions will go, and she will answer them. And if there's any questions that are worth chatting about as a group at the end, she will present those to us at that time. So thank you, Marisol.
Thank you, Pam, and welcome everybody.
All right, so let's jump in. All right, so I'm going to make it easy as we get started. This is not a class and there's no test at the end, but if there were, these are the answers. So this is what I hope that you take home with you today. Here are some really important key messages to remember when you're thinking about trees and water savings. First of all, that trees are a key part of a water-wise landscape. When you're caring for trees, you want to check the soil below the surface before you add any water and see what's going on. Woodchip mulch is a must, and that is something that we'll be talking about quite a bit, what it is and how to use it best. You also want to water slowly, thoroughly, and infrequently, not every day. For mature trees, we'll talk about how you apply water far away from the trunk. And also a reminder that water agencies, even in a drought, allow tree watering on any day of the week. So before we start talking about tree care, I want to pause for just a moment to remember the big picture. And that is that trees improve our quality of life. They are worth it. So let's treat them right to receive the maximum benefits back. I could talk for a few hours on a whole presentation on all the benefits that trees provide us, but we'll just remember that they make our lives better, and that they can really and easily coexist in a water-wise landscape. And let's talk about how to care for them. I want to take just one more moment to talk about planting. And note that if your tree isn't planted well, it may not live long enough for you to have to worry about how to care for it in a drought. So if you have questions about planting, I encourage you to check out our website, sactree.org, for much information about planting, including a fun and short how to plant video. All right, so why do you think we are so excited about mulch? Mulch is one of my favorite things. Let's talk about what mulch is. When I'm talking about mulch, and I use that term interchangeably with wood chips, what I'm talking about is that mulch is chipped up pieces of trees. Any part of the whole tree that has been chipped up, and that can be wood, branches, roots, leaves, anything like that, all chipped up. Organic matter is one way to describe the components of wood chip mulch. And you can tell from my enthusiasm, I hope, that it's fantastic, but why is it so great? Why do I care so much? The thing is, bare soil exposed to heat and wind loses water through evaporation very easily, and it is less able to absorb water due to the resulting compaction. So the first thing that mulch is doing is acting as an insulating blanket on top of the soil, helping keep moisture in the soil longer, and that makes a huge difference for your water savings. But there is another really key benefit to wood chip mulch, and that is the organic matter I mentioned in the wood chip mulch breaks down over time and adds organic matter into the soil. And what that does is it increases the soil's ability to hold water. So let's think about that. I'm gonna repeat that so we can really kind of think about what that means. Not only is the wood chip mulch preventing water loss through evaporation, it's insulating the ground, but it also is adding organic matter into the soil, which over time makes the soil better equipped to hold water, which is better for trees. And I just want to point out, I see that there's some questions in the chat, and we are doing all the questions in the Q&A tonight. So if you have any questions for my colleague Marisol, please enter those in the Q&A. Okay, so I talked about what mulch is, but it's also important to point out what mulch is not. Mulch is not rocks. Mulch is not plastic. It is real parts from real trees all ground up. What could be the problem with putting rocks around your trees? Well, when you think about it, rocks absorb a lot of heat and they can dry up. They can cause the soil to dry out more quickly, which is not helpful for water savings. So what about plastic? That seems really insulating, right? Well, the problem with putting anything impermeable over the soil is that it may help with water retention in the short term, but in the long term, it's much harder for the tree because it's blocking all the area that the rain may come in. And it also doesn't let the soil be improved by the wood chips. So you also may notice that one of the things I say mulch is not is redwood bark. And you're like, but Pam, that's a tree. What's wrong with that? Isn't that ground up tree parts? And that's true, except bark is designed to protect trees for a long period of time, right? And so it doesn't break down very quickly. So if you have mulch made up entirely of bark, it's not going to decompose very quickly. And so you're not going to get the soil enhancing benefits, the benefits of natural fertilizer to the tree that you get with other types of wood chips. And then from a practical standpoint, in my experience, having bark as a mulch doesn't work very well because it's kind of, I describe those pieces as like nuggets, they're kind of chunky. And then when it does rain, those chunks just kind of like fall right off, and end up flowing into the storm drain and clogging up. And it doesn't really stay put very well. Whereas wood chips that are made up of many different types of the tree, like, if you have a tree care company come and grind it up, it's like branches, it's leaves, it's a little bit of everything. And that tends to stick together a little better. And it almost forms kind of a mat over time, kind of like little puzzle pieces coming together. And that is just so much easier to deal with from a practical standpoint when you're managing your own yard. Another aspect to wood chip mulch that I see frequently is using a fabric weed barrier between the soil and the mulch. I am here to make a case and hopefully convince you to not use any landscape fabric because, it seems tempting, right? Like we want an easy care landscape and we don't want to have to deal with weeds. So if we put this barrier in, that'll help us. right? The problem is it is not a long-term solution. It does indeed prevent weeds for a couple years, but very quickly it starts to break down because the weeds grow through the fabric pretty easily, and then become all intertwined in it. And then on a bigger picture, the same thing I mentioned with the plastic, the biggest problem is that any type of weed fabric in between the soil and the wood chip mulch gets in the way of the mulch performing its number one job, which is to break down over time and improve the soil. It creates a barrier between that decomposing organic matter in the mulch and the soil that you want to improve. And if you use a permeable landscape fabric, it's still not a great idea because, again, the organic matter still can't reach the soil. And in my personal experience, I've tried everything at my house and at various planting sites over the last couple decades. And if you use a landscape fabric, the mulch, all the organic in the wood chip starts to break down no matter what you do. And it forms this like really rich layer of like compost on top of the landscape fabric that just becomes the most ideal situation for weeds to grow. So in the long term, it is not a smart choice. And this picture is from the airport, so it happens everywhere. Instead, what I recommend is putting a thick blanket of wood chips directly on top of the soil, or you can put cardboard in between the soil and the wood chips because that will break down over time. But a really thick layer of wood chips, I'm talking like 5 or 6 inches, will do a lot to discourage weeds all on its own just by being a thick barrier. So that's what I do in my own yard. However, with that thick barrier, you don't want to have it be right against the trunk of the tree, which is why we recommend a fluffy donut shape around your tree so that you get the nice thick benefits of a nice thick layer insulating the ground and decomposing over time, but it's not right against the trunk. And that's really key for how trees breathe and how they stay healthy by having oxygen available at the base of the trunk. Okay. So if mulch is so great, it must be really expensive and hard to get, right? Well, nope. The best things in life are free. So there's a few ways that you can get free mulch. If you want just a small amount, our partner SMUD has mulch available at their yard on Folsom Boulevard, and you can pick it up. Just bring your own bag and put it in your trunk. Or if you're looking for a big pile of mulch, like you saw in the first mulch slide I had, if you're looking for a lot for your whole yard, you can have a tree company deliver it to you for free. Tree companies are doing pruning and tree removals all the time and are looking to get rid of their loads and not having to pay to take it to a landfill. And there's so many benefits to using it. So you can contact a tree company you know locally. And there's also service like Chip Drop, where you know it's an app that you sign up and it connects people looking for mulch with tree companies that are looking to drop loads. And I've used all of those methods and had a lot of luck with Chip Drop. I got trees. I got a load of mulch within 48 hours of signing up. I don't know how common that is, but I was pretty pleased with that type of company. And I do want to point out that it is very unlikely to spread tree diseases with wood chips. It is not a concern generally to worry about there being a problem and that you could be infecting your landscape by receiving some chips, because the exact right combination of circumstances would have to occur in order to transfer diseased chip trees disease to a newly mulched tree. So I want to relieve that concern. However, one thing I do ask is I ask the tree company that I'm getting chips from, what types of trees make up the load of mulch, because there's a few types of trees I like to avoid that reseed easily, namely liquid amber is a tree with those porcupine balls that are so annoying, and those I find the seeds can travel in. And so that's something I don't care for. And I also don't care for mulch with palm in it because it's so stringy. When it's chipped up, it's just a little harder to move with your pitchfork. You can also purchase loads of mulch to be delivered if you feel really strongly that you want it all to have the same look. I've used a company like Hasty's. They sell many types of mulch, and my favorite that they sell is called playground bark because it's the most unprocessed and has the fewest additives that so many of those do. Yeah. So this is how you apply mulch for a young tree. What do you do when your tree is bigger and has a much larger canopy? And the answer is you put mulch, as much under the canopy as you can, right? So in the case of this yard on the bottom right, they've got some pathways through their front yard, and they've just mulched anywhere that they can that makes sense under the tree's canopy. And on the left, they have some lawn, but they also have a large mulch area around the outside. And so under those olive trees, there's as mulch as possible within the design of the yard. And as much as you can cover the bare soil, it's going to be improving the soil and retaining water. All right, so I love this slide because I think it's nice to pause for a minute and remind ourselves that a common myth is that the roots of a tree are a mirror of the canopy, when in fact, the shape of the roots and the structure is very different compared to the shape of the canopy typically. Instead, think of a wine glass sitting on a dinner plate. That's the metaphor that I like to use, because the majority of the roots don't go that deep. The majority of the roots are in the top 2 feet of soil only, because that is the best place to live if you're a root. That's where the water is. That's where the soil microorganisms live. That's a really nice area to be a happy root. And so that zone, again, it's a wine glass on a dinner plate, a wide area that can extend well past the width of the canopy if space allows. So some roots are structural and hold the tree in place. However, the roots that take up the water and the nutrients are at the edges of the canopy. And what this magnification drawing is showing is the root hairs at the very tips of the edge of the root structure, which are feeder roots. And so those root hairs, which you can't see with the naked eye, are what take in the water and the nutrients. And again, this is happening at the edge of the canopy. And this is going to come into play when we talk about where to apply the water when you're watering a mature tree later on. So here, what I want to point out is that when we start going down, we started thinking about mulch, and now we're diving underground and we're thinking about what the soil looks like. The ideal soil moisture, the key here is that it's not 100% of anything, right? There's some water, there's some air, some spaces in there between the soil. There's some minerals, especially common in clay soils. There's a lot of mineral nutrients. And then there's a little bit of organic matter, OM. It's a mixture. So what is happy soil for happy trees, right? These images show the soil particles in brown and the pore spaces in between in blue and white. And what you want to go for here is that there is some oxygen and some water. It's not all dry and it's not all saturated all the time. The roots don't like to be totally buried in water all the time. They need some oxygen in order to function. So we want it to be kind of just right in between. So how do you know it's just right? What does that look like and feel like, and how can you test? So there's a variety of ways to examine the soil. And the key is that when you're making a watering plan and a care plan for your trees, this is not something you need to do every day for the rest of your life, but it is really helpful to take a much closer look at your soil when you're establishing your watering plan and how frequently you need to water. Because if you know what is going on below the surface, you will have a lot of information about what your tree is experiencing and what you need to do. So there's a lot of ways that you can check this out. The most basic is a soil moisture meter. And this is a device that you stick into the soil, and it tells you how wet or how dry it is below. That's all you have to do. There's a huge range in price and thus accuracy of soil moisture meters, from $10 to more like $50. So depending on how excited you are about using a tech item like that, that is something to check out. The most helpful for me, I'm a tactile person, is to feel it in my hands. And so an easy way to do that is to use a trowel or a small shovel to dig below the surface. And you want to get at least 6 inches down or so, because again, if we're thinking about the roots being in the top 2 feet of soil, so you want to get just a ways down in there to really feel what the soil is like below the surface. And then you can kind of feel it in your hand and feel, is it very sticky? Is it wet? Is it forming a clump and staining my hand brown? Or is it very crumbly and dry and kind of falling apart? And those would be the 2 extremes for how the soil might feel as to whether it's very wet when it's really sticky versus it's very crumbly, it's very dry. There's also a fantastic tool called a soil probe that I love to use as well if you're interested in that. And you push it into the soil and pull it out, and it brings up a thin column of soil so you can see what the moisture level is like at different depths. So doing these kind of tests will really give you a lot of confidence in knowing when you need to be applying water to your trees and to your landscape. And we'll talk some more about when and how to do that. So the biggest question that we get at this type of class is, well, this is all great information, everything, but just tell me, how do I water my trees? When do I do it? And how much do I do? I just want to know that. And I totally hear that. However, if this was really obvious, really easy, and really straightforward for each one of us, you wouldn't be here with me at this class on a Thursday night. Because the problem is there are just so many variables that affect irrigation timing and amount. So the key is to check your soil below the surface before you water, like we just discussed. And at that point, you can get to know your soil and your drainage, right? And there's a lot of other factors that affect how often you may need to water. Obviously, seasonality, the weather, the temperature. If it's very windy, trees need more water because they transpire more quickly. And then to things that you can't control, like how much water is coming out of your sprinklers. So there are a lot of things to consider, and let's talk a little bit more closely about how to look for water stress, which is another thing to keep in mind, especially during a drought year and during a hot summer like we're having. So one thing that is interesting to consider is understanding trees' body language. Because in a picture like this is an ornamental pear tree whose leaves are looking pretty droopy. And the symptoms for overwatering and for underwatering look kind of the same. Because you remember that picture of the pore spaces and then the water and soil? It's also hard for a tree to stay saturated for a really long time, for the soil to stay saturated. So, spoiler alert, this tree needs water. But a tree that's being overwatered could look really similar. So when we're thinking about symptoms that trees have when they are experiencing water stress, when they are not getting enough water, and these are great to keep an eye out in your landscape. Some of the things would be the edges of the leaves are turning brown or getting crispy and curling, like you see on the oak tree leaves in this picture. The leaves may look kind of wilting, like they did in that previous photo of the pear tree. Over time, if there is drought stress for a more prolonged period of time, the tree can start to produce leaves that are smaller than normal, or they can drop their leaves early, or in the summer as opposed to the fall. And then other signs of stress in a tree can be suckers, which are those vigorous upright growths that come from the roots or the base of the trunk, or water sprouts, which are similar, really vertical, vigorous sprouts that come from branches. Those are both signs of a stressed tree. So here's a couple more pictures of stressed trees. The one on the left is an English elm, and you can see the branches with no leaves at the top and at the sides. And what that is showing me is that the previous year was the tree experienced some drought stress, and it to the point where those branches just died. And so the following year, no leaves at all are seen in those areas. That's a long-term drought stress symptom. And the tree on the right, the red maple, you think, well, wait a minute, that's beautiful. I would love a tree to look like that. But this was taken in July that I saw this tree. And this is a tree that would normally get that color in November. So early fall color like this is a sign that the tree is stressed and it's going dormant early in order to protect itself. So that is something to be on the lookout for in a dry year like this one. All right, so let's dive in a little more deeply on how to take care of young trees and what kind of water they need. Because we talked about mulch and how to protect your soil and just reduce your water use overall. We talked about checking the soil below the surface, right? We talked about looking in your yard for signs of drought stress symptoms in the leaves, for example. And now let's talk about how we actually apply the water when the trees are young. So when a tree is brand new in the ground, it needs water, at least 3 times a week. You really don't want the root ball to totally dry out right at planting. So if you're planting a tree in the summertime, that's something to keep in mind. But then after that first few, couple months, a young tree really just needs water a couple times a week. And when the tree is brand new, the roots haven't had a chance to grow out very far. And so we apply the water right at the base of the trunk. let's look at some examples. So here's some ways to apply that water, really basically. One of them is to use a bucket, and we love this method. It's like a really low-tech drip system, right? So you take a 5-gallon bucket, and you can get them at a hardware store, and they also have really sturdy ones available at paint stores. And then if you drill a tiny hole, like about 1/8 of an inch in diameter at the base, and you can see in the orange bucket, there's a tiny bit of water coming out here right at the bottom. That tiny hole will slowly let the water trickle out, about 5 gallons of water, over about 40 minutes. And it's really, really helpful to apply water slowly because it doesn't just run off, it stays and penetrates the ground deeply right by the tree, right where you want it. Okay. And so that slow, thorough soak is the goal. Another way to do that is with a soaker hose. And so on the bottom right, you can see that young tree has a soaker hose curled around the base there on top of the wood chips, and it's attached to a garden hose. And you can turn that on low and have that slowly seep out over time. And another option is to use a berm, and you see that on the left. And that's basically like a mini levee around the root ball where you can apply a bunch of water, and it will keep the water near the trunk and have it slowly percolate down into the soil. One key thing about the berm, if you choose to use that, is that you need to break a hole in it during rainy weather, because enough of our soils in Sacramento are clayey enough to be problematic and have too much water be held around the tree in the winter, which can also be damaging, like we've talked about. Also, after about 5 years, the roots will probably have grown out past that area and you wouldn't need a berm anyway, but it can be useful in the short term. My favorite is the 5-gallon bucket, because when it's a 5-gallon bucket, we know exactly how much water the tree is getting, which is 5 gallons. And so knowing what I'm teaching you today, that the young trees want that infrequent thorough soak a couple times a week and getting about 5 to 10 gallons each time, it's just a super easy way to know exactly what your tree is getting. And I love this picture that I took of a house I drove by in Citrus Heights, because through our shade tree, our free shade tree program, our partnership with SMUD, we provide over 10,000 trees per year to the community, and expert foresters like Marisol advise folks on how to care for them. And this person did exactly what we recommended, and their young tree, though small to start, is looking really great, and I was happy to see that. So one thing to note about young trees is that when they're young, like I mentioned, the water needs to be right at the trunk because that's where the roots are. But one key thing that changes over time is two things really, is that they need more water less often as they get older, and the water should be applied further from the trunk because that's where the roots are growing. So again, as the trees are growing, a mature tree is not going to need water once a week right by the trunk. You're going to start to want to water a mature tree at the drip line. Okay. And that water can be applied, every couple weeks, once a month, every other month, depending on the species of tree and what it may need, or depending on what other water you may be applying to your landscape. If you have other landscape plants you're watering, how shady it is, all that type of thing. So now that we are transitioning here to be talking about mature tree care, again, where you apply the water changes as the tree grows to be further away from the trunk, and you apply more water, but less often. So instead of applying by the trunk, we know from the wine glass on a plate photo and analogy that where the water needs to go is near the drip line. And when I'm talking about the drip line, picture the mature tree in a rainstorm and the water hitting the top of the canopy. And then does it flow like right down the trunk? No, it kind of flows over the leaves, over the side, and then falls down there, literally the drip line, right? And so that area in and around the edge of the canopy is what we call the drip line. And that's where you want to apply the water. So how often do you need to do that? I would say that is one of the biggest questions that folks have at this class. And, you know, I think depending on the type of tree you have, and again, what you're doing, I'm watering my mature trees once a month, in addition to other little bits of drip that they're getting. And that's totally adequate for a really established mature tree that is not a water hog species like a coast redwood, for example. And we'll talk a little bit more about different species as well, but that's a good place to start. But again, checking the soil before and after you apply that water will give you an idea of how long it takes to soak in and how often you may need to, and then when you may need to apply it again. So for mature tree, this is a great example of a mature tree in a lawn area. And you can see they're not watering their lawn a ton. They're letting that go brown a little bit because the stressed grass is okay in the summer here. It will totally recover, come back green and lush in the winter time. But in the summer, you do want to be checking on the health of your mature trees by providing supplemental water to them. So in this case, there is a soaker hose loosely circled around there in the vicinity of the drip line at the edge of the canopy there, right? So another option, if you don't have a soaker hose, and those are super easy to use. Again, you just put it onto the end of your garden hose. But there are other ways to apply the water too. I also use a fan sprinkler, or a circular sprinkler. I just turn it on low and I move it around the canopy. And if it's on low and I'm doing it in the early morning, that's still a perfectly efficient enough way to be applying water to an area like this. And you just want to kind of move it around to different parts of the canopy as much as you can access. Some cases there may be sidewalks and other things under the drip line, and just put it where you can. So that's another way to do that, as long as you may have a turf, lawn, or other plants in the area. Okay. So keep in mind that this is not expensive. This is doable. Okay. So we've worked out the cost of water that it takes to keep a mature tree happy in the summer, and it's about $3 a month. And that's what we're talking about, the needs of the tree. For the price of a coffee these days, you can water a mature tree and keep it happy and healthy. We got this. All right, so here's a little bit more information about using a soaker hose. So what you do is attach it to the end of your garden hose. And if you're going to leave it in place for a while, like if you don't have a lawn that you need to mow and you would need to move this, you can cover it with mulch. That will protect it from the sun and improve the efficiency, and also camouflage it for aesthetic purposes. But you can also just lay it out over the grass like you saw in the last picture. Soaker hoses don't work quite as good on slopes. A regular drip system is a little bit easier in a situation like that. But for most areas, they are very, very easy to use. And I also recommend adding a pressure regulator to your hose bib connection to avoid spraying with the hose or breaking it. And that's very inexpensive, and that would be added in between the garden hose and the hose bib. So drip irrigation, that is a whole separate class in itself, right? There's quite a bit to learn about different types available and how to set that up at your yard. But I'll just say a few things since it is really convenient and really efficient to use too. There's a couple main types that I recommend. And one is on the top left, it's the drip tubing with pressure regulating emitters added into that. And it is key that those emitters are pressure regulating. The emitters, excuse me, hold on. Emitters are not that expensive. They're, a few cents each, and the pressure regulating ones are just a couple cents more each. But it's really key to use that to make sure that all of the trees and plants on your drip line are getting the same amount of water when you're watering. Otherwise, just the water won't make it out to the end of the line, and only the water will go to the closer plants. So that's definitely worth it to make sure they're pressure regulating. But I really actually prefer using inline irrigation tubing because it's actually cheaper because you're not buying the tubing and the emitters. And it's also pressure regulating naturally. So I like to place them on top of the mulch. I don't mind that look aesthetically. Usually the other perennial plants and stuff I have kind of cover it up mostly anyway. Because if it's on top, I can look at it when it's running and make sure it's working instead of it being hidden under the mulch. So that's my preference for how to maintain that easily. So one thing to keep in mind when you're using emitters is that water comes out very slowly. Of them, it is drip irrigation, right? And so when you use the emitters, for example, you may have an emitter that is rated at 2 gallons per hour as to what it's letting out, right? And since you've learned that a young tree, for example, needs 10 gallons of water per week, we talked about that, you would have to run a 2 gallon per hour emitter for 5 hours to get enough water. Simple math, right? Or you can use multiple emitters around a tree so that you can water for less time. So it's just, don't be intimidated. The math is pretty simple, but it's just something to think about to make sure that your tree is getting enough water when you're using the drip irrigation. All right, so another couple of great irrigation tools that I want to point out is a hose bib timer. Another super inexpensive, low-tech solution that makes it so easy. So you put in the timer in between your hose and your faucet, and you set a timer and it'll run for as long as you want, and then you don't have to remember about turning your soaker hose off or turning off your sprinkler. And so that is super easy and can just take your mind off having to remember that. Or if you like techier stuff, the smart irrigation controllers are fantastic, and it's controlled through an app on your phone. So it takes into account things like the weather, and you can program multiple zones easily, and can be very easy to use once you get that set up. So smart controllers, like the one pictured here, are available in many places. And I like to shop at the SMUD Energy Store. I've gotten good price on that. But before you go to buy it, remember that your local water agency, they often have rebates that mostly or fully cover the cost of a smart irrigation controller because it's such a useful tool for water efficiency. So if you live in the city, you know, the Department of Utilities is your water provider. And if you don't know or remember who your water provider is, you can find that at Be Water Smart website. It's really easy to use, and it's easy to see if that's a local rebate that's currently happening, or if there's any other great rebates too. Definitely get familiar with your water agency. All right, so if you're planting a new tree, first of all, thank you. We love to hear that. You want to consider the water use of the tree that you're selecting and help it match the water use of the plants that it's going to be living with, right? And to be drought smart, to be water wise, to be climate ready, we encourage you to choose species that are tolerant of moderate to dry soils, because droughts are not uncommon in California. And in fact, in Sacramento, with our Mediterranean climate, we experience what feels like a mini drought every single year when we have our summers with no rain. So think about, you know, and with the trees that you already have, think about the species and their water needs. So if you need help identifying your tree, you're welcome to reach out to us. Myself and my colleagues at SacTree love getting emails about tree ID. And you can also check out our website, and we have a database of 80 of our favorite trees for the region. And you can see if your tree is there to learn a bit, to identify it and to learn a bit more about it, because we also share information about the tree's water needs there. So, and we have here some trees that are happier in drier soils, and some trees to keep in mind that rely on wetter soils for their life to be happy. All right, another really common question that we get is, do I need to water my native oak? Aren't they just, you know, adapted to this region, and aren't they used to the experience here? Do I need to water them? So the answer is that it depends, because it depends on how the tree grew up. Native trees that are specially adapted to our climate and that have never received supplemental water may not need any irrigation. In fact, overwatering them can hurt them, especially if that water is applied by the trunk. However, this is a very dry year, and some native trees will benefit from infrequent, like, you know, a couple times a summer, from an infrequent deep soaking. In contrast, a tree that is a native species to our area, like the valley oak that we're looking at on that right photo, this tree is growing in lawn, and this tree was planted as a young tree in this location, and it has always lived in an irrigated landscape. You can see that green lawn around it. So this tree would continue to like some infrequent irrigation as an adult. When trees get mature, they don't like big changes. I mean, who does, right? They want to keep what they're used to. So this tree would continue to want some irrigation, whereas this blue oak on the left could be harmed by some irrigation. However, I would give it, on a really dry year like this, I would give it an infrequent soak or two far away from the trunk, just once or twice this summer. So if you want to save water on your yard and if you want to have a river-friendly garden, you can and should still have trees. Removing turf around the trees and adding waterwise plants can be so beautiful. And let's talk about that a little bit. So how do you make a conversion like that? First of all, check with your water provider and see if they have any rebates or any connection to landscape designers. The city of Sacramento has had a similar program with rebates and help designing a waterwise landscape conversion. So definitely check that out if that's something you're interested in, if you're a city of Sacramento resident, and see if your water provider doesn't offer that, could they? Because any specific help like that would be really awesome, right? But for everyone, a few things to keep in mind is that one thing you want to be really cautious of is to avoid tilling around the tree to protect the roots. You can instead add a layer of cardboard with thick mulch on top to kill the grass right around the base of the trunk, right? So like a really, not against the trunk, right? Like that fluffy donut shape that we talked about, but a thick, like 8 inches of wood chip mulch on top of the grass, and you can use cardboard under there too. And so after several months, when the grass is dead, then you can plant some perennial shrubs and plants. It's helpful to avoid planting right at the base of the trunk because of course then you would be needing to irrigate right there. So I would keep that a few feet away at most, like you see in this photo. Another thing that will help with a conversion like this during this transition time is that you want to transition your watering from regular sprinklers into a drip system, perhaps, right? But slowly make that change to make it easier on the trees to live with the change in the water, right? So another thing you can do when you're thinking ahead about the planning is put in a separate hydrozone on a new valve for the tree. And so if you get into drip irrigation, that's something that can be really low maintenance once you set it up. You could have, you could set it up. There's lots of great YouTube videos on that specifically, or hire a landscaping company to do that as well. But having the trees on a separate hydrozone and a new valve will mean that you can have a separate watering regime for the trees, right? Because the perennials will probably want less water more frequently, and the trees are going to want more water but less often. So even though they're next to each other, the emitters or the irrigation for those two types of plants can be helpful to do differently if you're starting from scratch. And if you're not, there's definitely ways to work around that by the number of emitters you have and that type of thing to accommodate the differences. So rebates are also available for the plants themselves for many water agencies when you're doing a turf conversion as well. So one thing, another question that I get a lot is, well, Pam, I have a mature tree and I want to keep it, but I want to take out my lawn underneath it and I want to plant beautiful plants underneath it. But all the plants that I see for a waterwise landscape want full sun. How do I deal with that? Well, there are many great plant and shrub options to landscape underneath a canopy that are shade tolerant. And I've shown 6 of my favorites here. This is walking iris, coral bells, lily turf, Australian fuchsia, western spicebush, and Australian bluebell creeper. There's also many other California native plants. There's, a couple of these are California natives, but there's also many more California native plants that do really well in an environment like this too. And so I just want to encourage you with this slide that these plants exist. And if you have a very shaded yard that you're looking to take from lawn to a waterwise, river-friendly landscape, there are a lot of choices out there. And a couple of my favorite resources to find more about these plants and other examples for this type of situation is the UC Davis Arboretum All-Stars list, which is a informational site and a searchable plant database. And also the Regional Water Authority site has some really great plant lists for this type of situation too. Speaking of trees and waterwise landscapes, I frequently see new installations of really lovely drought-tolerant landscapes installed that don't have any trees planted along with their new beautiful perennial bushes. But I'm here to tell you, you can have both. Don't miss out on the shade and the beautiful architectural canopy that a big tree can bring to your yard and to your property. Trees are very water efficient to establish. We talked about needing only 5 to 10 gallons per week when they're young. And even when they need more water than that when they're mature, again, even the most water hungry tree, when it's mature, the cost to water that again is only about $3 per month. Trees are really water efficient to establish and to maintain, right? So if you're thinking about how is this transition going to happen over time, if the new plants I plant like sun and then the tree shades them over time, I promise you the transition of that will be slow enough over time that as the tree is growing quickly, it'll still take several years before it's totally going to shade out anything else. And the new plants will adapt over time, okay? Just pick the low water plants that you love. Pardon me. Okay, so to wrap up in a nutshell, and there's an acorn in a nutshell because I think I'm so funny. You want to check the soil before you water, right? The most water inefficient thing you could do is to water wet soil. So check below the surface, feel it in your hands. Is it really wet and sticky? Not time to add water. Or is it starting to get more dry and crumbly? That's time to think about applying some water for your trees, right? Mulch is fantastic. Mulch is my favorite. You can get it for free and you want it directly on top of the soil in order to insulate the ground and keep water in, and in order to have the organic matter in those chipped up wood bits improve the soil over the time and naturally fertilize your trees. When you do apply the water, you want to apply it slowly. And that's why a slow soaker hose or a drip system or water trickling out of a 5-gallon bucket works so great because it's not running off. It is targeting the area right by the roots where you want it to go. And you want to do that infrequently so that the soil has time to get really wet. And then it has time to get some oxygen back in the soil. So it has some air in those pore spaces between the soil particles, which again, it needs that oxygen in order to do all its work underground. You want to apply the water for mature trees far away from the trunk. As the trees grow and the roots spread out and then grow further and further from the trunk, the area that you want to target to apply the water is around the drip line. It's around the edge of the canopy and it's far away from the trunk. Another reminder when we're in drought times and we're thinking about conserving water and we're wanting to follow all the rules that our water agencies recommend, is that if you have a water agency that requires you to water on certain days of the week only, those requirements are all for hand watering and they do not apply when you are watering trees. And you can also use drip systems any day of the week. And that's true for any water agency. Now, you wouldn't want to water every single day, right? Because we've talked about this a lot. You want that water to be infrequent, like a couple times a week for a young tree, and maybe once or twice a month for a mature tree, right? But you don't have to, you can time it so that it's convenient for you. It doesn't have to be on a specific day when you're watering trees. And lastly, trees are worth it. They make our lives better. We are grateful to live under their canopy. And I am so grateful for you coming today. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the questions that I know you've been having. I want to make a plug that if you really like what you heard today, and if this was really useful and engaging for you, to please consider making a donation to the Sacramento Tree Foundation, because we could not do what we do and provide the great programming and resources that we offer without our community. So I welcome you to contact us in the future if you have any questions, and check out our website. But now we've reached the end of our presentation, and it's time to answer any questions if there's any that we need to address as a group. So I'm going to welcome Marisol to join us again. Hi.
Hello.
Are there any questions that we would like to talk about as a group that I did not address?
I have 3 or 4. First one was a question. Do you have a recommendation for a soaker hose?
Like a brand of soaker hose?
It didn't specify.
I have used a variety of brands. I don't have a brand preference. That's a great question. But generally you get what you pay for, you know, with hoses in general. So buy the nicest one that you feel comfortable with, I would recommend. I think that is really solid advice with garden hoses in general. But I don't have a favorite brand of soaker hose. I would say if you're watering mature trees, getting one that's at least or about 50 feet long is going to be really helpful, because when you're putting that around the drip line, the circumference area that you're getting gets really big really quickly. And so 50 foot in length is a good size to shoot for on a mature tree.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Hold on, it was about sheet mulching. So if there was turf around a tree and you are now mulching, how might that affect the watering for the tree?
So if you're trying to if you're trying to kill your grass because you want to convert to a waterwise landscape with mulch, how are we caring for the tree in that transition time?
I think so, because
okay.
Yeah, how do you water?
So the same way, because if you use cardboard, which you don't have to, but you can, if you use cardboard, it is permeable and it'll break down. And so you could still use a soaker hose in that same area. You may just need, the first few times you run it, you may need to run it a little longer than you will once the mulch has broken down a little bit and created more of a mat, and the cardboard is broken down a little bit. But you can water it in the exact same way with a fan sprinkler on low, with a soaker hose, with a drip system, even if you've already installed that. Any of those would work. It's just, I would put it on top of the mulch so that you can see it, and it's less likely to get clogged and stuff in that short term.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a visitor from coastal Southern California wondering about mature fruit trees, citrus and avocado, and right now, in the drought.
Sure. So if I was leading the pruning class that we do in the wintertime, which I welcome you all to join us, I would give you very different information about how to prune fruit trees than prune shade trees like we were talking about today. But in terms of watering, their needs are pretty similar. and the maintenance strategies are very similar. So again, having mulch wherever you can under those citrus and avocado, and caring for them and watering them like you would a mature tree is going to be key. There's not a lot of difference for the fruit trees in terms of the water needs and application recommended methods. The one thing I would add for fruit trees is that they do need a fertilizer in order to have the best fruit output. I don't recommend fertilizers regularly for shade trees. The organic matter in the mulch is really sufficient most of the time, but the fruit trees would need a fertilizer, and there's a lot of really easy to use granular organic fertilizers that you apply underneath the mulch.
Okay, thank you. There was a question that was utility specific. So
Okay.
Sacramento County is huge, so many water utilities. You said at the beginning that utilities allow watering any day of the week. Is that a definite yes? Because I think there's a fear that watering will not be allowed.
That is for trees. Yes, because the Regional Water Authority has worked closely with which is a kind of organizing body of water agencies for the state. They have worked closely with the governor and with local water agencies to make sure that the message is getting out there that it's okay to let your lawn get a little stressed and a little brown during a drought, but we still need to care for our trees. And so that is universal. And I want to be clear, it's not just any watering. We're talking about when you are watering trees, and especially when you're doing it in these water efficient ways that we've talked about tonight, using a soaker hose, using a drip system, that can happen on any day. And again, you don't need to do that every day. We recommend you don't do that every day for the reasons we talked about. But that is true. If you ever want to check your water agency's specific rules, because that just, I'll do all I can to relieve you, but if you just want to help sleep at night by looking it up, again, the Be Water Smart website, which is the Regional Water Authority's site, can direct you to your specific water agency, which would have their guidelines. And the Be Water Smart site will have that same information, that watering trees is exempt because the tree canopy is so critical to our infrastructure in urban areas.
Great, thank you. I think all the others I answered in text format. If there are any more questions, I think we still have participants. Now is the time to ask.
Yeah, if you have any questions, type them into the chat, the Q&A rather. And what we also can do is in our thank you email that we'll share out after we wrap up, probably in the next couple of days, is send a link to our website where there's a ton of information and more videos to watch about how to do the bucket watering, for example. And so there's a lot of tips there and a lot of great resources that we'd be happy to share with you. And also, if there's any questions you specifically have about what you've seen today, then reach out to us. We love to talk about trees. We'd be really happy to help. And you can reach myself, my email listed here, and you can also reach Marisol at treetips@sactree.org, and we'd be happy to help.
So we do have some more questions coming in.
Okay.
And I think you might have addressed this. There will be a recording sent in the thank you.
Yes, so there will be a recording either of this webinar or an identical webinar that happens at a different time is already on our website. We probably will not send the link in the email, but you can find the recorded webinar that's identical to this one from a previous date already there. So that is something to check out. But we won't be sending the link in email.
Okay, that same person had a question about 3 redwoods in a group. Do you just put the soaker hose around like the group?
Yeah, if they're within, I don't know, like 10 feet of each other, so I would just put the soaker hoses around the whole thing, so that's not too close to the trunk.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. And for redwoods, the coast redwoods are not, they're native to coastal, cool and foggy California, not hot Sacramento Valley. So they're going to need water at least every couple of weeks, a lot more frequently than some of the other mature trees here.
And then in the middle of the presentation, Pam, you said that you did not like palms in woodchip mulch and something else. What was the something?
The other thing was liquid amber trees, or sweet gum is a common name for it, because in my experience, the seed balls, those porcupine balls, I call them, that are so annoying to have, they can spread seeds that reseed in mulch, and that's the biggest problem to getting a tree company's wood chip mulch. So if I don't have those things in it, in the palm, really, there's nothing harmful about it. It's just annoying to deal with, because when you go to move the wood chips around with your pitchfork, they the palm frond pieces stick on the edge of it, and it's frustrating. And I just don't care for it aesthetically. But I have not had any problem with any other type of tree chipped up that I've used in my yard.
Great. That concludes the questions.
All right. Well, I will end the webinar right now. But thank you all for joining us. If you have any other questions, you can find us online, and have a great evening. Thank you all.